Welcome back. Where we left off last week, we had basically summarized each of the three main normative ethical theories in the Western tradition. The largest categories here are consequentialist theories, duty theories, and virtue theories. And this matches the description by Pfizer in the encyclopedia article that you all had read for last week. Within each of these broadest categories, though, there are in each of these broad categories, there's a main tradition. Under the consequentialist category, that's utilitarianism. Under the duty-based theories, that's Kantianism. And under the virtue theories, that's Aristotelianism. And I said a little bit more in for each of those theories in the last set of video lectures. So now what I'd like to do is talk a bit about some objections that can be made to each of these very general approaches to normative ethical theory. There are some well-known objections, well-known potential problems with each of these theories. And I'd like to talk through that before going on to talk about the kind of guidance that each of these theories can provide about our relation to environments. And the big question that we're going to come to by the end is there anything that's missing in these theories? It has seemed to many that who are thinking about environmental ethics in particular, that these traditional theories are inadequate to tell us about what we should do in our relations to nature, to natural environments, to environmental problems and environmental issues in general. And so I want to invite you all to think critically about these theories, about how well they can provide guidance on those things. But first, let's talk about some of the standard objections to these theories, even before we begin thinking about environmental issues. So one objection to utilitarian theories is that they don't have a place in their central ethical principle, which is the principle of utility, for recognizing things like what one individual deserves or what one individual or another individual's rights are. So let me give you some examples that clarify that. First example, so imagine that there is a thief who steals a car from a rich person who has, say, 10 cars. Okay, so the car thief steals one of these 10 cars. It could be the case that the car thief gets a lot more pleasure out of stealing the car and being able to do whatever they do with the car for the period of time that they have it in their possession than the person that they stole the car from would lose. So in other words, the person they stole the car from maybe will have like a -10 utility as a result of that. They'll sort of experience 10 pain points, so to speak. Whereas the person who stole the car may get a +100 in pleasure points. So it seems like there's a net gain in utility in this situation where the car thief steals the car. And if your main moral principle is the principle of utility, namely you should maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the greatest number of those affected by an action, then it seems like utilitarianism recommends saying that the car theft is perfectly justified and actually good. Okay, but a lot of people looking at that case say, well, wait, maybe the thief gets more utility out of the car than the rich person got out of it, but it's still wrong to steal the car, and it's still something that it ought to be rectified. The car ought to be returned to its owner. Why? Because the person who owns the car has a right to the car. They have acquired it in the right way so that that it's theirs, they own it, and that means they get to say whether or not another individual drives it, takes it around town, crashes it, or whatever. Whereas the car thief doesn't own the car and therefore doesn't have a right to the car. So if you think that like rights to something like property or sometimes should be respected, even if respecting those rights means that there's less that there's less utility overall, then that means you think that that sometimes rights trump utility, you could say, or rights are more important than utility. Let me give another example. So suppose that there is a society, a small society of 1,000 people, say, and it's determined that if the society adopts a certain practice, which I'm going to describe in a moment, then that will increase the net utility of the society. Here's the practice, okay? So once every year, a single individual in that society will be randomly selected and will be charged with crimes that they didn't commit, and will be tortured and killed in the town square. And that by doing this, that this practice, if it's adopted, will cut down on crime in the society overall and will enhance social cohesion. Suppose that that's the effect of this particular action that would be done every year, okay? Then it seems like there might be a very high negative utility for the single individual that was chosen, but there's some significant positive utility for every other individual in the society. So suppose that it's a negative 100 for the one individual who is selected, scapegoated, and tortured and killed, but it's a +1 for everybody else in the society. Well, the one individual times a negative 100 utility is a negative 100 utility total, but the +1 times the 999 other people in the society is a plus 999. So almost 10 times as much pleasure is generated overall by the action as pain. So again, if your main ethical principle is you should always act so as to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the greatest number, it seems like in this case you should favor the scapegoating and you should support this particular practice. The problem with this, of course, for utilitarianism is that most of us would say that a scapegoating practice like that is wrong, that there's something wrong with it, that society shouldn't adopt such practices. Even if they do lead to greater overall utility, they're still wrong. And why do we say that? Well, a very a sort of easy way to explain why we say that, a very plausible answer as to why we think that this is wrong, is we think that there are some things that that nobody has a right to do to another person. So that if somebody is innocent, it's not that the society doesn't have a right to just punish them, for some other reason or because that benefits the majority of people in the society. That the person who's being tortured and killed has a right to their own life. They have a right to not be interfered with in their life, to not be, not have their bodily autonomy interfered with by being tortured and so on. So one way to articulate what's wrong with this is it doesn't recognize that the person who's being tortured and killed doesn't deserve to be tortured and killed, or the person who's being tortured and killed has a right not to be tortured and killed. Okay, so these concepts of what somebody deserves, what somebody has a right to, they don't have a natural place in utilitarianism, because the principle of utility doesn't say maximize respect for people's rights or maximize giving people what they deserve. It says maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the greatest number of people affected. Another way to understand what's gone wrong with utilitarianism here is that utilitarianism is trying to sum up the total pleasure and sum up the total pain that would result from some action. And when it sums up in this way, it sums up across individuals in a community, and it doesn't make distinctions between these individuals or say that some kinds of that a person in a certain circumstance getting pleasure is okay, but a person getting pleasure or pain is acceptable, but a person in another circumstance getting the same level of pleasure and pain is unacceptable. It just treats all pleasure and pain of any person as of the same value as the pleasure and pain of any other person, without recognizing any distinctions in terms of, who has what property or who has committed a crime or not committed a crime, and so on. And so because it's not recognizing those distinctions, it's not really able to recognize rights or what people deserve. Now, there is a well-known strategy of reply to this objection, which I'll just mention. I won't go into detail, but it's a way that utilitarians have of trying to save their theory against this objection, which is they say that we ought to recognize, we ought to set up laws that articulate certain rights for people, like the right not to be tortured and killed arbitrarily, and the right not to have one's property taken arbitrarily through theft, and so on. We ought to set up those laws, and we ought to enforce them and respect them, because setting up those laws and enforcing and respecting them will have greater utility overall than not doing so. And what's happened here is there's a shift from evaluating actions in a kind of one-at-a-time way to evaluating the rules by which we organize society and the rules by which we organize our individual action, in terms of which rules are more likely to lead to greater utility overall. And so this move is sometimes called a move to rule utilitarianism rather than an act utilitarianism. The idea is we're applying the principle of utility to the selection of the rules that we live by, rather than to the selection of individual actions in each circumstance taken separately. So I just wanted to mention that. I realize that we're going through this stuff extremely quickly, so I'm really just trying to give you a little bit of a sense of how the traditional debates go, but not trying to build, full mastery of this material. If you were taking an ethics course, you would spend 4 or 5 or 6, a course focused just on ethics or ethics in general, you'd spend 4 or 5 or 6 weeks probably on the material I'm covering in this video of objections to consequentialist theories, duty-based theories, and virtue theories. So we are going extremely fast. Another possible objection to utilitarianism that's very often made is that people seem to care, we seem to care about more than just pleasure and pain, and we want to care about more than just pleasure and pain. And so since utilitarianism says that the right action is the one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain, but doesn't consider any other kinds of values, like doesn't consider beauty or the cultivation of skills or education and ability to learn about things or self-expression. So because it doesn't consider any of those other things that we care about, that we think are also part of a valuable life, it has to be an incomplete theory. It's going to miss some things about what we should do. It's not always going to provide the right suggestion about what we should do, and that makes it not a fully acceptable general ethical theory or normative ethical theory. It means that there's some kind of problem with it. So here's an example that I can give that helps to make this case. Famous example sometimes called a thought experiment, and because it's not an example that's based on something that really happens or has really happened, but is rather a kind of imagined example that's supposed to help you when you think about it to see what kinds of conclusions should or should not be drawn from the example. So the example is this: imagine that there's a machine that if you get into this machine, or anyone gets into this machine, they can experience an extraordinary amount of pleasure and no pain at all. Okay, they'll be fed through tubes. They can stay in this machine as long as they want, and as long as they're in this machine, they're going to experience much more pleasure and much less pain than they would if they were outside of the machine. Okay, and so people can stay in these machines their whole life. Let's call this the pleasure machine. Okay. Now the question is, would you want to get into the pleasure machine for as long as you could? Would you want to live as much of your life in the pleasure machine as you could? Would you choose to do that? Would you be encouraging other people, as many other people as possible, to get into these machines and stay in them as long as they could? Okay. Probably most of you would, listening to this video, are thinking to yourself, no, I wouldn't want to spend my whole life in such a machine, and no, I wouldn't want to encourage as many people as possible to get into such a machine and stay in there forever. But what does the principle of utility say? The principle of utility says we should act so as to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the greatest number of beings affected by our action. So the principle of utility seems to suggest that we should be encouraging as many people to get in the pleasure machine and stay in as long as possible as we can. But that seems wrong to us. So the problem with the problem here is that utilitarianism seems to, again, recommend for us to do something that when we think about it, we say, no, we really don't think that that's what we should do in this case. What has gone wrong? Well, a lot of people thinking about this example think that what has gone wrong is that utilitarianism values too little. It only values pleasure and pain, whereas human beings, having to make decisions in our lives, we care about more than just pleasure and pain. We care about creativity. We care about connection with other people. We care about being being able to learn about the world. Okay, have real experiences of real things, experiences of nature, and so on. So all of those things are not just a matter of feeling pleasure and pain, and so utilitarianism must be missing something if they say that the only criterion of good action is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. That's how that objection works.